silence in many ways. So I'd like you to speak, and then I'd like to invite Prabhat to give us another point of view, perhaps, on it.
Thanks, Geeta. I was 22 years old when the riots happened, and I think that... Oh gosh, I hate standing. I think that for me and for many people in this room, the riots were the central event that defined our lives. And the memory of those riots has determined how we have carried out our practice of journalism, but also how we see ourselves as citizens of residents of the city and of this country in the years since. On my wall, I have a few images that I still hang to remind me of what happened during those weeks. The riots affected me so much that for years after the riots happened, I had an almost cinematic memory of what happened on each day. I knew how many people had died in each spot, in each place, and it's often difficult for me to go around the city without recalling specific events. Looking at these pictures today immediately brings some of those back. I know that Hoshi Jal shot that one on Shaukat Ali Road one morning. There's a picture that Hoshi shot at Ray Road there of that old man slumped behind a tank that Vivan Sundaram later turned into a sculpture. But we saw so much violence that I think for the human mind to comprehend this, in the end you boil it down to a few sometimes ridiculously simple images. One of the images I have on my wall is a photograph that was shot by Sherwin Crasto. The riots happened 20 years ago when the Mahim Urs was happening, as you may remember, as it's happening now. And there's a picture at the other end of the giant wheels sort of going up in flames. And the picture I have on my wall sort of, to me, exemplifies just how surreal this all is. It has two men in the foreground carrying wooden horses over their shoulders, as you have this sheet of flame in the background and you see these giant wheels. But in my mental memory, in the movie of my mind, the image I always carry is the image of men early in the morning pushing their cars away from Mahim Beach. And I don't know how many of you remember this, but a rumor got around Bombay that Iraqi commandos were going to land on speedboats and suddenly come with these sophisticated weapons and start shooting up the city. So every night, these fellows, many of them from Shivaji Park, would drive their cars down to the Shivaji Park beach and flash their headlights onto the sea, armed with hockey sticks and cricket stumps, waiting to intercept these commandos. And because they had flashed their lights all night, by the morning their batteries would have died. And so they would be pushing their cars away. And they would recharge them and come back the next night. And to me, again, that's among the images I carry, but many of the images I carry are of the enormous amount of violence that we saw. One day, Kalpana Sharma and I sat on what was an afternoon, I seem to remember, on one of the first slum rehabilitation buildings that had come up in Dharavi. And so we had this vantage point and we could see all of Dharavi below us. And you could see the demarcations of housing colonies where people lived. Some some had borders because there were nalas, others had high walls. And for hours we watched this battle as people from one rooftop to a next threw Molotov cocktails on each other or stones. And another memory I carry is sensory. For months after the riots, I couldn't pass a garbage dump without being reminded of the smell of dead bodies. And what had happened, that was triggered off by the fact that on January the 11th, 1993, Meena and Clarence and a few of us from the Times of India went through Bombay counting. We split up and went through many of the morgues to count bodies. The January the 10th had been a really gruesome day. We'd seen all sorts of violence, and some of these pictures show that at Asalfa, I think that's Asalfa, which is in Ghatkopar, there was a go down of waste that had been set afire, and many of it stored a lot of big drums that must have been used to store chemicals before then, and it had residue inside it. And so as the heat got to this chemical residue, these things would be launched high into the air. And there was a crowd on top of that hillock that would cheer every time one of these enormous drums went into the air. There was the timber mart at Railroad that had been set afire that day, and that was an enormous fire too. We saw, so the next day we sort of fanned out and decided that we would count the number of bodies. And by then, the bodies had been piling up for many days. This was the second phase of the riots. The doctors were simply overwhelmed, but also the air conditioning systems and the refrigeration systems were overwhelmed. So these bodies were bloated. Many of them were really stinking. There were maggots everywhere. But we were able to report the next day that when the police commissioner Bapat told us at his press conference that about 50 people were killed, we had actually counted about 500 bodies. And so it was quite easy to be able to tell his lie on that. But the overwhelming memory I have of the riots is one of immense frustration. At Asalfa that morning, when this fire went up, the fire also spread to a nearby slum colony. And the residents were sort of gathering their bundles up and began to walk. And this was an astonishingly dramatic image. There were these people almost in this way that we seem to remember partition, sort of carrying all their belongings on their shoulders as these huge flames rose in the background, and the photographers were running all around trying to get images of this. And people reacted in very different ways. I remember one man actually broke a smile because there was a European photographer called Dario Mitidieri who was shooting, and this man, as his home was going up, smiled for the camera. But one boy, he was 18 years old, he was a student, his name was Mahindra Kadam, and he sort of snapped at us and he said, "Why don't you guys do something to help us? This will sell on newspapers tomorrow, but you need to be doing something to help us." And that's among sort of the conversations I carry in my head. It was also that we would be late in the night in the newsroom, and we would be getting these calls from frightened people, Muslim families, who would be saying, "We can see a mob coming for us. We've tried to call the police, we've tried to call the army, the lines are jammed, or they refuse to do anything. You call them." And in that moment, we could really see the limits of journalism, that we could write about these things, but there was nothing that we could do. The frustration has never quite ended, because a few years after that, in the state elections, the BJP and the Sena actually came to power. They didn't pay the price from the electorate for their awesome crimes. And ever since then, the Sri Krishna Commission, as we know, did not did not deliver justice to the victims. And I think that sense of injustice is really now being embodied in the landscape of this new Bombay, this new Mumbai that we see around it. 20 years ago, in 1991, 23% of people in Bombay lived in slums. That number has now grown to 54%. There's been an enormous amount of ghettoisation, I think. Mumbai, for instance, has now become a place of refuge for Bombay's Muslims. Places like Jogeshwari, which were mixed, have now, the lines there have been completely hardened. Hindus have moved out of Muslim neighborhoods, Muslims have moved out of Hindu neighborhoods. But by not dealing, I think, with this question of injustice, we have allowed ourselves in the 2 decades since to come to accept all sorts of other injustices. Now we don't bat an eyelid when we see this enormous amount of deprivation around us in India's commercial capital, in one of the richest cities in India. And I think that's been the true legacy of the riots, that it's allowed us to be blind, not just to the violence at that time, but the violence that has followed since then. Thanks.